Good morning. I'm going to start by saying thank you. Thank you for letting me be here. It really is an inspiring conference. And also thank you to my colleague Jane Brinkley, who co-authored this. So I'm going to be talking about the London 2012 Olympic Park, now called the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And with our understanding of lighting and even the primary scientific research moving so quickly, I've tried to focus on the lessons that we learned through our involvement that are actually most useful to others, so things that can actually be applied in other schemes. It's a big scheme. It's almost 250 hectares in size, dominated by brownfield. What we're looking at here is actually looking from the north. So this area became the North Park, where most of the habitat creation was. This is the River Lee, which runs through the heart of the site, and about there is where the stadium now is. And the South Park, there were areas of habitat created, but they were much more gardens, so very formal spaces, but still with the river as a corridor through it. So the people designing the lighting had a lot of issues to deal with. They had to provide safe, secure and accessible routes across the park in legacy, which is now after the Games, and in Games time itself. And also the security and public safety through the Games. A high-profile international event, and around all the issues of health, of public safety, there's also the issue that fear is real. The things somebody's afraid of might not be real, but that person's fear is real to them and has to be respected by all the parties. So the issues, the safety, sustainability, energy efficiency, the visual design, it had to look gorgeous for the Games, understandably. Neighbours, people live around here. The wildlife, and there was a biodiversity action plan written specifically for the Olympic Park, and the cost. Cost was, as those of you from the UK know from the papers, cost was under great scrutiny throughout. And one of the ways that was worked on was to design for legacy for now. So the things that were going to be permanent. And then overlay temporary things. So the lighting, there was permanent lighting, additional lighting that was going to go into the Games and then be removed. Even the bridges through the site. If you went there in Games time, and you went again now, you'd be walking over a bridge thinking, gosh, this is a lot slimmer than I remember it. And that's because they designed the bridges. So one part was a permanent structure, and then next to it was a temporary one, with a surface overlaid on the whole, but afterwards they could whip out a temporary structure. So there was a lot of thought went into what went on there. So this image comes from the lighting strategy, and here there's the North Park with the main habitat creation areas, the river running through, and the South Park with the gardens areas, but a lot of concrete and the main stadium and buildings all around the edges. When planning permission was granted, there was a condition requiring a biodiversity action plan specific to the site and also a lighting strategy. And something I'm going to keep coming back to is the fact it was critical that the wildlife, obviously the biodiversity action plan was all about the wildlife, but they were also mentioned in the lighting strategy. If they hadn't been, we'd have had two potentially conflicting documents, and the strength of the arguments to remember the wildlife would have been a lot weaker. But it was written into the lighting strategy, so it wasn't just, well, safety is important, the look's important. The lighting engineers, when they read down the list, they always saw the wildlife matters too. So one of the key concepts was actually to try to create a dark corridor. This is urban this is in London. This is not the sort of dark corridor you'd be getting in somewhere like the South Downs National Park. But with the river, with these habitat areas, the idea was there were paths along here, and those would be lit. There were paths along the river, and they weren't. And that actually ties in really well with the issues of fear and health and safety, because people going in the day wander all over. People going there late in the evening, there are lit paths they can follow. These, it isn't sort of a little bit of lighting to tempt them in. It's just, no, these are not lit areas. People follow the paths that are inviting to them. They stay in the lit areas. And that was good because it helped strengthen the argument to say, no, we're not going to creep in and say, oh, well, we could just have bollard lighting, that'll be okay. Just no. The strategy said areas with no lighting. It would never work perfectly because there's always issues that weren't thought of when the strategy was written. But it was in there, so it wasn't just saying, oh, well, we can't do that. You can't have those dark areas. It was, well, why not? Because it was in the strategy and the strategy was agreed. So if you're going to change that, you've got to have a good reason. The Olympic Park was a big project. So it was split up into lots of small projects. Every venue, every bridge, every structure, every area of lighting was its own project with design team. Obviously, designers were working on a lot of projects, but it meant there were an awful lot of individuals involved. But they could all refer to the strategies, and it gave very clear guidance on the principles, and as here, simple examples that light spill on river, not good, directional lighting, better. You'd be hard pushed not to understand the message behind that. Another good thing was the Code of Construction Practice had a requirement that every design team had to include a project ecologist. So there was a named person for the lighting designers to talk to. And also, the Olympic Delivery Authority had its own sustainability team, so that there was somebody who would check the designs and say, is this meeting all the targets? They had a raft of themes. Energy efficiency, biodiversity was one of them. And something that was helpful for us was actually the deadline. This is a scheme that couldn't be delivered late. So all of these little schemes, they'd need their own full planning permission on top of the outline permission that had been granted to the whole site. And with that, it meant if a designer was saying, I want to do something, but this really exciting art installation, it's light, it's going to look great, it's in the middle of your habitat area, bright light's going to look brilliant. If it deviated from the lighting strategy, which obviously something like that would, then it would still need its permission. You'd say, well, you're deviating from the strategy, you're adding risks to the project. You'll have to explain that, and if the local planning authority isn't happy, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Do you have time to go back to the drawing board? No? Well, let's stick with the strategy. So it did reduce the deviations. Another thing that was helpful was the communication. The lighting designers, this is one of the very basic light spill drawings, and as well as producing the standard ones with contour lines, they actually produced, to help the ecologists understand, to be frank, ones where they used, colours to help us think. And, you know, in this case, it only went down to 1 lux. Where there were more complicated issues, they did actually do the full 3D analysis where they modelled how lighting would bounce around in areas. It's never going to be perfect, but the ecologists and the lighting engineers and the overall designers were talking, And we were trying to talk a language that we all understood. And actually having an ecologist say to a lighting engineer, I don't understand your drawing. Why not do it? If the lighting engineer didn't say to you, I don't understand this back stuff, is that a problem or not? Are they rare? You'd be thinking, come on guys, talk to me, tell me you've got to worry about it. We need to tell them we don't understand if we don't. So getting biodiversity written into the lighting strategy was critical. One of the reasons was because the project took some years to deliver, so there were new people coming, exciting new designers coming in with new ideas, and being able to say to them, hang on, no, actually, there's ideas in place, we need to stick with those, let's look, see how yours fit in, let's not get carried away with some funky new idea. What there also was on the site were the assurance teams. And these were people who went along after the building was done, like building inspectors, but for everything on the park. And they went to see, had you put in what you've been told to? And that meant the contractors knew if they sort of forgot to put the shielding on a light, someone would come afterwards and check. And it would be removed and they'd have to replace it at their own cost. It focuses the mind. It's a very big project. I know you can't do that sort of thing on every project, but there are useful things that can help other people. So, on a large complex scheme like this, having biodiversity written in to the lighting design, to the lighting strategy, not just as a separate biodiversity action plan, was so important and so valuable. Implementing that strategy meant it gave clear guidance. This picture here is a real picture of North Park, and you can't see any lighting columns because there aren't any in this place. So this is one of the places people wouldn't be encouraged to walk after dark. Step back from the river, behind the higher ground, and there were paths with lighting. Yesterday, Dawn Vivian mentioned the problem of the norm. We've always done it this way. Nobody's tried that way. Another thing the Olympic Delivery Authority did was create a website full of what they called the Learning Legacy Papers. And that, again, that's unusual and it's brilliant because it meant every discipline, they got to write a short paper on their experience. And that means if you're having a bit of an argument with a lighting engineer or with a designer who says, well, nobody's done this before, and if it's something that's been mentioned for the Olympic Park, go on the Learning Legacy website because the lighting one was written by the lighting engineers. And it mentions ecology. So to them, they said, this is normal to us, and it worked fine, and we produced something brilliant for our clients that the world saw and went, wow, at. But it still followed the strategy, and it still looked after the wildlife. The details wouldn't be something that would apply in other sites. I'd never recommend that, because every site's got to be looked at in its own case, and this one had its own pressures, had its own complexities. But actually saying lighting engineers are perfectly capable of thinking about wildlife, and so are designers, and so are landscape architects, and light installations can look really, really funky, but sometimes they're in the wrong place. You've got things here that you can use help argue the case, so please do. And I know the slides are going to be available afterwards, so those links are going to be available. If it's useful, use it, please. Thank you very much for inviting me. I just put that up at the end because I don't tweet, but I know a man who does. Thank you.